I'd like to introduce Dr. Beck, who will be talking to us today about the livestock grazing. He's an associate professor at the Department of Ecosystem Science and Management at the University of Wyoming. His lab focuses on understanding influences of environmental and anthropogenic change on range-bound wildlife habitats and populations. They also evaluate effectiveness of conservation practices and policies intended to mitigate impacts to wildlife and their habitats. And additionally, his staff and students have been tremendously helpful in putting together the maps used in the science framework. So with that, thank you, Jeff.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm looking forward to this talk and also the opportunity to walk out without answering any questions. So, first time in my life. So I'll be talking today about livestock grazing, and probably most of you know that livestock grazing is the single largest landscape use across the sagebrush biome consistently across private and public lands, and most estimates show that more than 90% of the sagebrush biome is grazed during some point in the year. So a lot of the symposium has been based on kind of a couple of questions that are really fundamental to livestock grazing ultimately, and of course sage grouse, and that is we have this system, and how resilient and resistant is it to change, resilience to disturbance and change to invasion of annual grasses. And when we look at this question focused right on livestock and sage grouse, there may be some direct impacts that we might be able to understand. They're really kind of hard to understand because there's differences in diet selection and even habitat use, but maybe indirectly there's a larger set of influences that we can think of. That's why I've made that arrow larger. And what we know from the literature from 4 review articles is that really grazing more than likely is changing the composition, structure, and productivity of the plants that sage grouse use during nesting and early brood rearing to conceal themselves from predation. So grazing herbivory is a process. Animals are selecting nutritious forages based on their life stage and requirements that they have to meet growth and production. Economically, it's highly important, and range managers and economists are focused on increasing the productivity and efficiency of these animals from rangelands. However, even though it may be an individual process for an animal, we really do incur a lot of management, whether it be herding or salting or other practices, including fencing, and the actual permit of grazing on public lands to achieve the goals that individual producers have. And this is also tempered by the seasonality of use, right? So if you have snow in the winter, part of the forage is covered up and not available to these animals, and they're changing diets, and the same would be true within the summer season. And so it is kind of a complex issue when we think about resilience and resistance of sagebrush communities to livestock grazing. And there's quite a few examples where differences in strategy or management have led to different effects on sagebrush communities. This is one example here. I really like this one from the sheep experiment station in southeastern Idaho. You can see on the one side of the fence where it was spring grazed, there really is no production of forbs because that's the time of year when the sheep are there and they were selectively taking those really palatable forbs. On the other side, where it's grazed in the fall after growth had occurred, then just that simple change led to a higher abundance of, and higher cover, of course, of forbs, and actually there is less sagebrush. You can't quite see that because of all the forbs compared to the other side when animals are not grazing sagebrush. So kind of keep that in mind. I'll be showing and talking more about things that's kind of related to this as I go. So ultimately we have a sagebrush system. It is really variable across the entire range of sagebrush, east to west, north to south, and it does provide some functions. One of the most important functions it has is wildlife habitat, and wildlife habitat, of course, is quite a few things, but it is really related in many ways to the structure of vegetation and the composition of those plants. And you look at this community, you can see shrubs in there. There's different species, not just Wyoming Big Sagebrush, but there's rabbit brush, there's grasses, there's bare ground, there's forbs in here. And these are all important when you think about the life cycle of sage grouse and how they may meet their the requirements to successfully nest and perpetuate a population that occurs in this area, and across the range this is the case. So as I begin, I need to point out a definition of improper livestock grazing. I'll be talking about proper livestock grazing and improper livestock grazing. It's actually defined in phase 1 of the strategy, part 1, not phase 1, part 1 of the strategy. And you'll see that definition right here. So we're looking at grazing that impedes progress toward or maintenance of ecological processes and the desired plant community composition and structure within a given set of site conditions and the natural range of variability, including climate variability, natural disturbance regimes expected within a management planning time horizon. So there's a lot going on there, right? But we think, you know, it's not just overuse, but it's more about timing, how that might change. Species composition is very related to site conditions and their natural range of variability. So I'm talking really about part 2 of the strategy and how grazing management is portrayed in that document. And it is portrayed in 2 ways. There's 2 scales. The first scale is this mid-scale consideration. You've seen similar maps today explaining this, where on this map here you see the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies management zones. There's 7 of those. They're all labeled MZ1 through MZ7, Roman numerals. And then we have these ecoregions also that are really similar, and they oftentimes pair up really well with the management zones, but not necessarily all the time. And I like this morning Gene had even a simplified version, just kind of looked at 3, going from Montana in the northeast all the way over to the Great Basin, and they kind of broke up maybe even more simply and kind of easier to understand. But the point is with grazing management is, you know, in a field office situation, when we were looking at this, or even a little bit larger than that, maybe within a state or one of these regions, you know, we have to look at things. We're thinking about the response of an area to disturbances, like grazing. You know, how resilient and resistant is this site to these disturbances? And so we can look. There's a lot of spatial data that are implemented into the resilience and resistance effort that's going on right now. So, for instance, right here, you can see based on soil moisture and temperature regimes where resilience and resistance has been mapped. And so you have the mid-scale evaluation of, you know, I'm thinking about grazing. Do I need to change something? Well, I can relatively look at the resilience and resistance of the site based on those soil properties. And then I go a little bit more and I want to look at the wildlife potential for the site. What's the capacity to support sage grouse or any other target species? It was mentioned that other species are going to be added, including things like reptiles and migration corridors for big game. So we have the breeding probability for sage grouse right here in those same areas. So it gives a consideration of relative suitability for breeding habitat for sage grouse. And then if we want to look at the threats have been identified, but, you know, on a spatial basis, where are they at? And here's one that I'm really familiar with in our portion of the range in Wyoming, which is energy development here. This map depicts oil and gas well density per square kilometer, and that's really useful information. So you can kind of see the basis here. You know, we start really high at a higher level, maybe 80,000 foot level. And then the next thing we do is we drop down. The second scale is local scale considerations. You might envision yourself on the horseback here, heading out for the day, working with cattle. Well, you know, locally, what can we do? And this is where we focus a lot. Dave Pike mentioned, you know, a lot of his career. He's been looking at site level considerations. They're really important. But we have to start high, and then we drill down into the site level. And so there are 3 things that are identified in part 2 of the strategy. First is, you know, we're going to identify ecological sites. As they're mapped, we have that basis of information to evaluate kind of what do we have out here as far as relative resilience to disturbance and resistance to invasive annual grasses. Number 2, we can evaluate current ecological dynamics within those sites and potential restoration pathways. I'll show you some state and transition model diagrams that have those illustrated really well. And then finally, knowing all the information we have, then we select grazing management practices that have the potential to increase the overall functioning of those ecosystems. Functions like water capture, regeneration and reestablishment of seeds and plants, maintaining soil on the site. You can envision that, right? All the ecological functions that we expect a site to have is going to function properly, and then habitat conditions for species like the greater sage grouse. And the way that this is illustrated with the state and transition diagrams, either specific species, but more often than not, functional groups that are either desirable or less desirable. And I just kind of split up some here that you could relate to really well, right? Perennial forbs are considered very desirable, as are big sagebrush and bunch grasses, perennial bunch grasses. On the other side, I've got cheatgrass, tumbling mustard, which is not very desirable. And then I've got a short-statured Sandberg's bluegrass, which with a lot of grazing oftentimes becomes part of the grazing-resistant community that it occurs in a lot of our sagebrush areas. So I'm going to first take you now, I'm going to take you from the northeast and all the way over to the Great Basin with a few ecological sites. So this one is one of the more, and I'll be talking about resilience and resistance. So high resilience and resistance. To interpret how these work, this box right here is a state, and within the state there are other boxes nested within that larger state. Those are community phases that the community could rotate between based on disturbance and time and practices. There are also restoration pathways. For instance, you'll see one right here, and there's a catalog on I cut it off on the right side, but it's narrated, right? All those numbers are narrated, exactly what would have to happen for a state to change or a phase to change in that kind of, or restoration pathway. So in this case, we have a silver sagebrush community which has a good mix of perennial cool season and warm season grasses and forbs. You see that on the top, and that's a good state for this site. Below that, this is Wyoming Big Sagebrush, which also occurs in that northeastern area, but kind of sometimes mixed a lot with silver sagebrush. And it's kind of hard to see this, but this one has more of an annual influence, and it's potentially kind of in this state where it's not really sustainable, and it may shift if we're not careful. We continue to graze it, and this is where grazing management comes in. When is the grazing going to occur? The problem is when it's grazed when those plants are actively growing in the spring, when those cool season plants are growing. The next one I like because it's closer to home. This is these photos I'll show you are from the Platte River Valley by Saratoga, Wyoming. And this site right here, 10 to 14 inch Wyoming Big Sagebrush site. The top photo right here shows the reference state. Abundant big sagebrush, perennial grass, bunch grasses. Again, if grazing occurs, and especially if it's continuously grazed, then you'll have this state right here, which occurs when we have a grazing resistant site, which is dominated by Sandberg's bluegrass and thick spike wheatgrass, which is a rhizomatous grass that is more grazing resistant. Unfortunately, if grazing continues for a long period of time, then your site can look like this with the eroded state, which the only living herbaceous plants are actually underneath the canopy of shrubs or cactus, prickly pear cactus in this area. And this site is very prone to invasion if there's, once, in fact, it says in the narrative that actually once annual grasses show up, then it's likely to be dominated by those grasses in those interspaces. Another site here, further west. So this right here we have 10 to 22 inch, so a lot of more variability, but mountain big sagebrush. The issue here is introgression of pinyon pine and juniper. So you see the juniper trees encroaching here. This is considered a phase 2 woodland where we still have an understory with shrubs, sagebrush, and grasses, and some forbs, but it's very prone over time with more grazing and no other management, no removal of those trees, that we can end up becoming this final state here, the eroded state, where basically we've lost the understory that would be there if we had removed the junipers. And so a consideration too, and grazing, well, where does grazing fit in? Grazing is a disturbance, and when you're back up in this stage, if you continue to graze without any other management, you will reduce the valuable understory plants in this site and continue to kind of promote the establishment and growth of these juniper trees. And then here's maybe one of the more extreme examples here. So we have a site here, that's sagebrush dominated, but the understory's been removed over time. This is a drier site, Wyoming Big Sagebrush, but in the Great Basin. And sites in Oregon, Nevada, Idaho look really similar to this. And so it's been invaded. It has annuals in here now. Perennial grasses are not very dominant. And I did mean to mention earlier that there, in parentheses, it will mention in these state and transition models if the phase is at risk. So this one is, if there's further disturbance, which there likely will be, then you'll end up moving down to this direction if a fire starts, and you'll have a site dominated by annuals, very few perennials, and so that's the state we're trying to avoid, but it does occur more commonly than not in these type of sites. So just a couple last points to kind of talk about cheatgrass and wildfire and grazing and how all that kind of relates to one another. This is a nice diagram from the part 2 of the strategy, the science strategy. You can see on the y-axis here we have a gradient of herbaceous fuel loads here, the highest level here. Inverse to that would be sagebrush fuel loads, so they're higher down here. And then we've got fire severity on the x-axis. So where does grazing kind of fit in? If we can actually use grazing to eliminate herbaceous fuels, right? So this is where we have the highest potential for grazing to actually interact and reduce fire potential and severity of fires. But as we go down and finally we have really severe weather events, high winds, hot temperatures, low humidity, then that's when weather conditions are going to kind of take over, and grazing doesn't really influence anything. Then we're kind of outside of that realm, and then we're into where fire weather is more influential. And consideration of, because cheatgrass, again, this is our resistance piece of resilience and resistance, is how could grazing be used to reduce cheatgrass cover. You kind of see on the x-axis 4 different scenarios of grazing. And then the arrows, I think this is a nice diagram. It explains things pretty clearly. So right here with no grazing, if we do not graze, cheatgrass will likely increase to its ecological potential for a site. Early spring, when cheatgrass is actively growing, it's a cool season plant, we can knock it down with early spring grazing. Peak season, and also knock it down to promote perennial grasses. There's a point to do that and to reduce fire frequency too. And then right here, peak season, if grazing occurs as perennial grasses begin to flower, cheatgrass will likely increase. And finally, dormant season, in the winter, it doesn't really affect perennial grasses, but it does reduce fire load, so that's another consideration. So those are my conclusions right there. I'll let you read those. I'm going to walk out the door, and it's been a great experience. Thank you very much.